Looking at Europe after World War II, most of Western Europe was allied with the United States, and most of those countries had democratic governments with capitalist economies. So France is going to try to build up their own individual strength because they didn't want to continue to rely on the United States. And so, under Charles de Gaulle, he's going to try to free France from influence from these two superpowers. And France is going to put a lot of money into developing their own nuclear weapons and successfully test their first atomic bomb in 1964. Meanwhile, in the UK and in Britain, we're going to see an increase in what we call the welfare state. And this wasn't true just in Britain. We actually saw it throughout most of Western Europe. But the welfare state refers to this policy where they tried to reduce the inequalities in society. And it's going to be represented by groups like the Labour Party in Britain. And so they help spread things like Medicare, Medicaid, medical insurance for most people. They provided unemployment payments to people. They provided family aid that gave extra money to families with children. They provided housing, and some of these ideas of the welfare state are even going to spread to the United States. A good example of this is LBJ's Great Society program. It included many of these ideas, including health care for the poor and for the elderly, and programs to help the poor. And so it wasn't just in Europe. We see some of it in the United States as well, but the United States was a little more leery towards providing more widespread welfare programs. West Germany actually recovered quite quickly after World War II. It was known as this big economic miracle. And not only did they recover quickly, but they would go on to become one of the strongest economies in the entire world. We're also going to see the slow growth of the European Union. And so the idea of this European Union, it started out as a European steel and coal community, which included four European nations, Germany, Italy, France, and Benelux. And gradually, this grew into the European Economic Community and later the European communities. And the goal was to build a common economy and increase trade between member nations. And so the idea was to cut down on tariffs and create kind of an open market economy. And with the creation of this European Union, it actually was quite successful and helped aid huge economic growth in Europe. And by 1989, Britain joined, as well as Ireland, Spain, Portugal, and Greece. And they even developed a common currency, which is now the euro, a central bank, and a common parliament. And until more recent years, the EEC was one of the strongest economic units in the entire world. Shifting over to Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe was quite a bit different from Western Europe. It was aligned with the Soviet Union, and most of Eastern Europe were communist states. Most of those communist states were under the direct control of the Soviet Union. One of the exceptions, though, was Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, under Marshal Tito, is going to resist Soviet control. And instead, they create an independent communist state. And so they were not aligned with the United States or the Soviet Union. And that was pretty rare at this time, because what ends up happening is we almost have this kind of bipolar world where most of the world is either allied with the United States or the Soviet Union. There were a few nations who tried to remain independent, and Yugoslavia was one of the few of those that did kind of remain independent. Meanwhile, after the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev is going to take power and tries to create a easing of some of the harsher policies of Stalin. And many prisoners were released from Stalin's work camps. We see kind of a brief thaw in Soviet culture during his years, a little bit easing of some of the harsher censorship of the Soviet Union as well. Overall, it wasn't a big change, but things were a little bit better. But there were clear limits to how much influence and power he would allow these other nations to have. Some good examples of that: the Hungarian Challenge in Hungary. With this process of de-Stalinization, it kind of led to this pro-democratic movement that grew in Hungary. And protesters began to push for a democratic style government. A new government is even announced their neutrality and tries to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact. And Khrushchev sends in the tanks to put down the uprising and restore a strong communist regime in Hungary. Similarly, the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia, a liberal government is established in Czechoslovakia, and they tried to also create kind of a softer version of communism in Czechoslovakia. And again, the Soviet Union wasn't going to put up with that. They send in the army, they restore a more rigid, strong communist leadership there instead. We also see a growing movement in Poland, the Solidarity movement. This was a movement that was led by the Catholic Church, who had lost most of their influence under communism, and the workers of Poland. And so they're going to challenge Soviet dominance in Poland. And even though immediately they weren't successful, ultimately the Polish army took control of the state under the strong influence of the Soviet Union.